is Christopher Hoover, and for my presentation, I have chosen database security. This is for a topic presentation assignment, Spring 2016, Software Engineering 322, Database Management. I'm going to start with a quick overview of database security. Database security is a broad term referring to the collective measures taken to secure all the components of a database from security threats and general misuse. It's a very holistic term that encompasses both the server, the client, and users of a database. Components of the database that this may cover include, besides what I just listed, would be data stored in a database server, a database management system, DBMS, database workflow applications, and users of the database, which would include the clients of a database, the administrator of the database, pretty much anybody who has access to a database. Necessary that database security encompasses all parts that may be incorporated in a database, as database security is not as simple as just encrypting some files and being done with it. There are many points of entry that a security threat could penetrate into a database, and this isn't just isolated to the database itself. It's anything that may access the database, whether it's over a network or at a physical location. This wide view in mind, let's take a look at some simple examples of security implementations for a database. One way would be restricting unauthorized access by users or anybody, just unauthorized access to the database. You restrict and you have less of a security threat. There's also load/stress testing and capacity testing. This has to do with the physical implementation of the database, and you want to be sure that a database can handle an influx of users, whether this be a natural influx, such as a high peak time on any given day, or whether it's an unnatural influx, such as a DOS attack. Another general example of database security would be the physical security of the database server and backup equipment. This is important, as if somebody could penetrate into your organization, walk down the hallway, and go into the back room, they can just rip the hard drives right out of your computer and walk away with your entire database. You need to make sure that your database is in a secure location and cannot be accessed by any person who just comes in off the street. The same goes with the backup equipment. You can't have the backup equipment just lying out on a table where anybody can access it. It has to be physically locked down. Reviewing Another one would be reviewing existing system for any known or unknown vulnerabilities. Well, this is important and it's just a general, it's a given. You constantly want to be reviewing your system and making sure that there aren't any known vulnerabilities that you have just going for yourself. You don't want that. As I have just briefly gone over ways to implement database security, I'm now going to break it down and do a quick history of databases and how different security threats have arisen to the common era. Before the 1960s, there were no databases incorporated into computers. I mean, computers weren't even really around back then. Before the 1960s, there were libraries. And libraries, depending on what type of library, whether they were a top secret government library or just your public library, they too still had a way of database security. Uh, Libraries, if they were a top secret government library, again, goes back to the physical security. Nobody could just walk in off the street and access this important information that the government was holding in these libraries. There's always been a form of security related to information, whether it's with a library or now with computers, as we'll get into right here through these years. In the 1960s, we saw our first instances of computerized databases. There was no standardized format, and it was all very primal, kind of, and primal, but primitive and basic. This is when we had our first understanding of ways to digitize large sets of data. And into the 1970s here, we had two systems, the Ingress system and System R, which would then carry over into a lot of ways that we do database queries and whatnot these days, but this is where it started. And these are the two major database system prototypes, and these came about in the 70s. In the 80s, we had structured query language, SQL, and that's when that first showed up. And that became the standard query language. The 70s and 80s were an easier time for database security because back then there wasn't any internet yet. And this is when major problems for the database security started arising. And we see that first come up in the 90s with the advent of the World Wide Web, or right when the World Wide Web started becoming really popular and online businesses became widespread. The advent of the internet and online businesses, databases had to become super secure because with once you hook a database up to the internet, anybody can have access to it from anywhere in the world, and that's a big problem for secured information, private information. You don't want somebody from Uganda being able to connect to a banking database here in America and being able to transfer funds or anything along those lines. So this is when database security started being like, hey, we gotta, we gotta do things right now. The problem that database security solves is simply ensuring private information remains private and the database remains functional. What this means is when it's necessary to protect sensitive data, whether it's personal information, financial transactions, anything that you want to have remained private, you want to make sure it remains private. You don't want somebody who doesn't have shouldn't have access to that information to be able to access it. Through database security, you're able to ensure that this data remains private. And it's also necessary for the smooth operation of database functionality. And this is to prevent malware to become incorporated into your database and mess everything up, or a denial of service attack to come in and crash your server and nobody being able to access anything on your database, or other threats, and we'll get into that in a second. And that brings us to the top 10 database threats. Threat number one is excessive and unused privileges. What this is when users accessing the database for one reason may have other access privileges on their account that they don't generally use, but they may use those other privileges and exploit them for malicious intents. The solution to this is to limit user access privileges to only what is absolutely necessary for their purposes. Database threat number two is privileged abuse. And this kind of ties into number one, but it's also kind of different. The explanation is certain access privileges from a user, they may be used for other purposes, like if a user has the ability to download, or not download, but view certain files on the database, but not download. They can use third-party software to then download what they view online. And that is not the intended use of their privileges, but they may use it for that. I mean, you can't really stop them. You have to think ahead of them and limit their use to uses that cannot be exploited. Database threat number three is input injection, formerly SQL injection. And I didn't do much on NoSQL, but NoSQL is supposedly a way to prevent a lot of this type of exploit. And what this is inserting malicious SQL or other statements into a database to gain access or disrupt database functionality. And the only way to prevent this is to make sure your database doesn't have any parts where a user could inject statements, SQL or NoSQL, big data otherwise. You have to just make sure your database is pretty invulnerable to this type of attack. Uh, Big threat number three is malware, and malware could be from something a user downloaded onto the database or otherwise, but it's basically just malicious software intended to disrupt database functionality. And to prevent this, I mean, you just want to restrict what software can be run on a database system and who's able to input stuff that they're not supposed to. Number five on our list of the top 10 database threats is a weak audit trail. And a weak audit trail is a failure to collect a comprehensive record of database transactions. Uh, what this essentially means is every time somebody does something on the database, whether it's like add to it or take away from it, there is a record that's left behind that tells what happened. If the database doesn't track everything that goes on in a database, somebody could download the entire database or manipulate their user privileges, and there would be no way for the administrator to know what happened. So what you really need is a very comprehensive audit trail that tracks everything that goes on in a database, and that's the best thing you can have for database security. Number six is storage media exposure, and that's a physical backup data for a database is often unprotected from physical or virtual theft. And we went over this in the brief introduction. Is you want to have your database, whether it's the backup or the physical or the hard or the hard drive that the database is carried on, to be protected from just somebody walking up and taking it. You don't want that happening. You don't want someone coming off the street and taking it. That's pretty self-explanatory. Number seven is the exploitation of vulnerable, misconfigured databases. And the explanation for this is vulnerable database is left improperly configured because of inability to keep up with workload or simply because it was overlooked. And from my research is this happens a lot. Is There's so much going on in a business, or there's so much going on at wherever a database is located, that somebody would overlook the fact that nobody changed the administrator password. So anybody who can guess the default administrator password, maybe it's just password, and that's a huge database exploit or a vulnerability. You want to make sure that your database is completely configured and it's up to date, and that's number eight on the top 10 database threats is unmanaged sensitive data. And this occurs when one of the administrators of the database, let's say, adds a list of user phone numbers and addresses and forgets to mark that down anywhere, forgets that he decided to do that. And this is then a part of the database and it's not marked as sensitive. Maybe it doesn't get encrypted or taken care of as other sensitive data is. And then if somebody's looking through the database, they uncover this, they're like, hey, look, all this personal information isn't even encrypted. It's not sent. That's a big problem. So you want to make sure that any sensitive data that's added to the database is tracked and managed properly. Number nine is a denial of service attack. And this is an outside threat. This occurs when somebody decides that they want to disrupt the functionality of the database in one way or another. And the way to do this, you need to block the source of the attack. There's different sources. There's companies that they'll take care of, have dial service protection, and just limit recurring requests from the same IP, or just limit the recurring requests over a short period of time, something along those lines. Number 10 is limited security expertise and education, and this one's like a personnel problem. This is the system administrators haven't kept up with changing times and thus employ outdated security measures. And for this, you pretty much need to just make sure like the people managing your database know what's going on today, not 10 years ago. Now the question is, how does database security solve the problem? Well, the problem, as we went over, was to ensure that sensitive information remains sensitive and private. And the only way to really do this, and the only way database security manages this, is to prevent. You have to prevent the data from being compromised. And that's the most important thing. The most important thing is to take preventative measures to ensure that sensitive data, private information, remains private and secure, and remain because once a database is compromised, irrevocable damage and loss may occur. So you want to make sure that a database is not compromised. That's pretty much the only way to make sure it doesn't happen in the first place. And you do this with proper planning before a database breach or crash, and that's the only way to ensure no loss or theft of data ensues. Implementing database security, it's a good thing to remember what is referred to as Anderson's rule, and that you cannot construct a database with scale, functionality, and security, because if you design a large system for ease of access, it becomes insecure. While if you make it watertight, it becomes impossible to use. And that's a very good thing to keep in mind, because if you want to have a functional database, it has to be accessible in some ways, but the ways in which a database is accessible are usually the biggest security holes. So what you need to do is achieve a balance between security and functionality. If you employ too much security, this will result in poor functionality, but opting for too much functionality may result in poor security, right? So you must employ security measures in a case-by-case manner with this above mentioned balance in mind. One type of technology that's related hand in hand with database security is encryption. If you have sensitive data, you want it to have encrypted on your database. And I'm not going to go into encryption, but you can look it up. Encryption is great. And some examples of software, there's numerous. numerous softwares. A couple examples are CoreGuard, SQL Audit Guard, and RC/Secure. And these are just various ways to secure your data from different types of security threats. Okay, that was my presentation on database security. I hope you learned a lot, and thank you for watching.